Satya, and the workshop title is right there in front of you all.
Good morning, everybody. So, Sahel and Tala and I have developed this presentation for you today. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today, but I'm going to run it with you instead, so no problem. First of all, a little bit about myself, because probably a lot of you would know a lot about Sahel if you've had something to do with him in the past. He has a lot of, obviously, very impressive credentials and people that he works with as a political scientist and futures professor. My background is a little bit different. Mine is more from, the majority of my background is actually as an officer in the Australian Air Force, as both a pilot and an engineer. And then the last maybe 10 years or so, I've spent most of it in an engineering environment in more the corporate world, working in aerospace, wind energy, oil and gas, not my favourite, I have to say, and now back into wind energy again. And we're building offshore wind farms off the Strait of Taiwan at the moment. So that's a little bit about my career background. So what brings me to a position where I can be standing in front of you talking about this? Well, the studies that I've done and where my passion lies is actually somewhere quite different to my career. So many years ago, I actually began doing Prout College under Sahel, Marcus Bussey, who I'm sure many of you know, and also Michael Towsey, who's in the audience somewhere over here, and also Ivana, this is the wife of Sahel as well. And so that began the start of a very transformative period for me, learning more about futures topics, philosophical topics, things that weren't engineering. And then I went on from that to do a master's in leadership and a master's in training and development. So my passion is actually leadership development and coaching and facilitation, these types of things. So in the next year or two, I'll be transitioning more into that than I am in my paid career, one might say. So anyway, that's a little bit of background to me. Let's move forward. So what we're going to do today is take a look at how is the world changing. We're going to develop implications and find the neo-humanist perspective on some of those changes that we're going to see, and that's going to be work that you do, it's not going to be work that I do. We're then going to reverse engineer our perspective and develop a neo-humanist education checklist. And then we're going to apply the checklist to various scenarios, and we're going to allocate funding. So it's going to be quite interactive. I hope you all have a pen and paper, or if you don't, that someone in your row has a pen and paper, because after probably about the first half hour, then we're going to get into some activities. First of all, a little bit about futures. Is that working? Yeah, it is. Okay. A little bit about futures. It's maybe a bit of a complex idea for some, but if you think of strategy, that's something a little bit out in the future, but something which you can plan towards. If you think about operations, that's something very close and maybe more reactive that you don't do so much planning for. Futures is a space that isn't operations, it isn't strategic, it's actually even further out there. And it's so far out into the future that everything is divergent, not convergent. And so because of that, it's very hard to plan. Instead, you have to use a very different set of tools, a set of tools that is more around creativity and also your responsiveness to change. So it's about setting up learning structures, for example, so that you can adapt to changes as you see them coming in, rather than being so direct and maybe just doing a strategic plan per se. So that's a little bit of context to futures. Here's another piece of context. So P.R. Sarkar had said that you've entered a period of galloping time. What's important about this is it means that as individuals, you actually have far more capacity to affect change in the world at a time like this. For example, you can see here Desmond Tutu awards the Peace Prize to Parkland shooting survivors. So individuals with individual action can have a much, much greater impact and visibility in the world. The other thing that might be of interest to people is VUCA. You might have heard of this before: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. This is basically how the world is becoming now: more volatile, more uncertain. And so in a period like this, it's actually harder to do the strategic planning that I mentioned before. Instead, we have to look at other things. So in particular, the previous slide was referring to, in effect, volatility, the pace of change. So with pace of change, then it also demands, not only is it about your individual action, but it's also about the vision that you create. So that's a big part of what we're going to look at today. Not only is it vision, but it's also practice. This is actually quite good timing. As you know, Djokovic just won the tennis the other day. But this is actually an interview from last year. Basically, that which you can imagine, and then the second piece is practice. Those two combined can bring something into the present. So there's this idea in future studies that you can't bring into the present a future that you cannot imagine. I'll say that again. You cannot bring into the present a future that you cannot imagine. So this is why the thinking that is different to the thinking that created the problem is necessary. It's an expansion that needs to happen. Okay, the takeaway from this: if you imagined an activity, you're more likely to apply it. So for those of you who are involved in educational pursuits, my question for you to consider here is, how can you apply this to your pedagogical or andragogical work? You're imagining what robots can do, a how to draw activity book. Okay, now we're going to get into some of the trends that are going on at the moment. So the 5 bases we're going to look at are technological change, climate change and the food chain, the rise of decentralized learning, the rise of conservatism and fascism, and the rise of women. So first of all, technological change. The real-time predictive genie. This is the AI world coming to us. Computers so advanced that they can figure out the answers to things in real time. Mechanisation of labour. As we have more mechanisation of labour, a lot of people are talking about universal basic income because there's a fear that a lot of jobs will go. What does that mean for education? The rise of renewables. Renewables are making huge advances at the moment. Decentralised energy cooperatives. Peer-to-peer is also another huge theme that is coming through. So that's why we see things like more decentralisation of various themes. Meditation as a technology for better health, and the role of technology in supporting our values. So let's take a look. Robots and the future, or AI in the future. So if we think beyond it a little bit, maybe it's not just about robots that help us in some kind of symbiosis, but what if it's actually a friendship? Has anyone seen Westworld? Yeah, taking relationships to an entirely different level.
Excuse me, Satya, what do you mean by the rise of renewables?
Well, we'll get to it in a moment. So then here we have the reducing cost of technologies. So here we can see fossil fuels are in the purple. On the left-hand side, you can see the cost of them in 2018. On the right-hand side, in the green and the blue, you can see solar, onshore wind, offshore wind. And you can see the really big offshore wind here is from 2012, and it's already dropped down to be significantly less than all of the fossil fuels, actually. This is the company that I work for, by the way. So what they've done is they've set up a great learning loop between policymakers and themselves. So policymakers create demand for offshore wind, the industry invests in innovation and supply chain, industrial learning drives down the costs, lowered costs allow for higher ambition, and then the policymakers set the new level again. So that's really helped to drive the technology and innovation. And you can also see over here, just by comparison of size, 1991, this was the size of the windmills in the industry, and now we're having these offshore windmills that are absolutely huge. and many, many more than you can put into an onshore environment. Because you can, we're building, the wind farm that we're doing first up in Taiwan is, I think, 111 turbines, and that's one of about, it must be about a dozen different sites. Then we have decentralised energy cooperatives. These are happening on two fronts. On one front, you see a lot of buyers' cooperatives. So people banding together, and because of that, the sheer numbers can therefore negotiate cheaper prices in the form of a buyers' cooperative. But the other thing that we're starting to see, and we've noticed it in Australia in particular, is there's also energy producers. So where the grid is actually unable to really supply a decent amount of power, people will go out and invest in solar, and people are discussing the possibility of setting up small energy production cooperatives to then sell back to the grid with the excesses that they don't need for themselves, or just even for their local area. And how change happens. So it wasn't due to the lack of stone that the Stone Age ended. This is the Asian Development Bank, Sahel Hasni. So you can see here, this is coal power retirements. And based on the cost issue that we saw before, it's actually cheaper to invest in offshore wind and solar than it is to invest in coal. Here's another interesting technology, only sun and seawater. They call it the sea drop. So it's the first commercial agricultural system of its time. It just uses seawater and solar energy. I actually don't know where it is, but I'm sure you can Google it. The sun drop. It's just to show you, give you some inspiration that actually there's this amazing technology out there. It's not the lack of science that is preventing us from moving forward. We have the technologies. We don't necessarily have the will or the capital will or the economic will or the political will. This is the issue. Water from air. Solar powered panels that trap water vapor. Pulling drinking water from the air. Lots of technologies that do this action. Technologies of the mind. Most people here would be aware of this, but there's a lot more studies that now back up the experience of a lot of people in this room. So the way in which meditation actually improves health. So rather than taking your injection of antibiotics, let's say, maybe there's a meditation you take for that cough, who knows. Some shifting values. So this is the Asian Development Bank. This is going to be a very, very quick run through a tool called causal layered analysis, which was actually developed by Sahel. So at the top, on the top line, we're just going to look at the top left under International Bank. And it says ADB, Asian Development Bank, finances by number of kilometres, roads and other utility infrastructure. This is a layer that we call litany. It's also kind of like a newspaper headline. It's what's visible. Then you look at what is the cause of that, what is the systemic cause underneath it. So underneath that is population growth, a greater number of cars, increased wealth and larger flats is what drives the need for that. And underneath the systemic is a layer called worldview. So under worldview, you can see that it's very car-centric worldview. It's all about ownership, individual ownership, the right to drive whenever, wherever. And then underneath that, you have a layer called myth or metaphor. And this is the story underneath it, the unconscious story that actually has the stronger effect. And this is, I love my car. So then how do you transform a situation like this? Because just investing in something else at the very top level does not necessarily result in a greater systems or philosophical change or a mindset change. Instead, you actually have to start at the level of metaphor. And the level of metaphor is the slowest to change, but it has the longest impact. So instead, you change it across to I love my neighbourhood. This is the new metaphor. And anyone who's involved in marketing or leadership or these sorts of topics, you will know that the way that you affect cultural change is through story. So this is all, or strong cultural change is through story. So this is why this is also so important. The worldview is about human and connection-centred. It's all about mobility due to good planning. The systems that support this would be integrated planning, driverless, autonomous vehicles, shared and pooled transport, smart city systems. And then what that would result in is the Asian Development Bank financing integrated and sustainable urban and transport planning, rather than the infrastructure itself necessarily, because creating more infrastructure is not the answer. Better planning, better sharing, that's the answer. So we've gone from the individual to the community, where the focus is on strategy. So then we have the question to consider here then is, how will material, cognitive and spiritual technologies change us? And therefore, what are the implications for education? Next, we're going to move on to is climate change and the food chain. Lab-grown meats. So maybe there's a couple of buildings in London that produce all of the meat in a lab for the entire European population. Does that make it vegetarian? Food chain collapse. So there's a number of articles that you can find at the moment talking about the impacts of climate change and what that's doing to the food chain. In particular, the things at the bottom of the food chain, which then can result in collapse. So for example, plankton blooms and things like this. So we're noticing it in the marine environment in particular at the moment. You might have also seen articles about the loss of insects and pollinators. This is also something very, very dire for our food systems. Obviously also very dire for the insects themselves. Agriculture. So agriculture alongside transportation and I can't remember what the third thing is, they are the biggest contributors to carbon at the moment when it comes to climate change. So the way that we do agriculture is a problem because of the way that it contributes in terms of carbon, but not only that, the more land that we clear, then that also makes it doubly problematic because then we have less trees. Interestingly, this is where the meat grown in a lab is potentially helpful because you don't have to clear trees in order to grow meat in a lab. So, the question here is, how will education look under changed environmental conditions? Number 3, student-driven learning. So this is about learning anywhere, from anyone, at any time. There is a rise in what they're calling personal learning clouds. So rather than having to go to an institution to learn something, for a start, a lot of people, when they need to learn something, where do they go? YouTube, Google. It doesn't mean they're learning the right information, but that's where people will go as an immediate source. And so in a similar way, this decentralization of learning is also applying to, you can see it in corporate situations, it's already happening, and there are obviously trends towards this in the education institutional realms as well. So let's take a look. This is another causal-aid analysis that Sahel did with an educational organisation, whereby if they look at the current paradigm, the educational paradigm or the institutional paradigm was the cog in the factory. It's lecture-centred, it's skills for industrial economy, and it's all about the job. But instead, what we want to be moving across towards is the knowledge navigator in the global playground. This is more student-led types of education, where you get to pick and choose the parts that are of interest to you. The idea of the badges fits very nicely into this as well. Student-centred, facilitative learning, it's about adaptability, and it's all about the client, the person who's doing the learning. This is, I don't know if you've heard of BRAC before, but it's a large non-profit organisation in Bangladesh. They do a lot of community development work using educational methods, but it's not a school system, and they've won a lot of awards for it. So if you haven't heard about them, I do recommend having a look and seeing what they're doing. But they've had very, very big success in transforming areas through educational programs that are not your typical educational program. Neohumanism, I mean, that's part of the reason why we're all here. So this shifting from it being about the job to also it being about the character. How is it that we are developing our character? How is it that we are transcending the sentiments that we all naturally have? Here's some pictures and images of a new learning paradigm. So then the question becomes, how and what will we learn in the future? What's the new game that we're going to create? The next one, the rise of fascism and conservatism. I think most parts of the planet are seeing this at the moment. In Europe here, we're seeing the rise of a lot of neo-Nazi philosophies, and obviously the US is really seeing a lot of the same sort of thing right now. And then we're also seeing a backlash against meditation. So, this whole section is about all the things that neohumanism stand for, having a resisting force. So the American Center for Law and Justice, which is, despite its name, actually a conservative Christian group, is now trying to sue over what it calls a Buddhist campaign in school, some kind of Buddhist brainwashing of their students. They don't see the value in the meditation, they're scared about the meditation, and it's a really big pushback, despite the science and the evidence against that. Number 5, the rise of women.
Yay!
Careful.
Be careful.
So we can see a lot of different ways that the women are starting to rise up and do better. Now, that's not to say, of course, that women aren't still being persecuted in various parts of the world. That's obviously still the case. And it's not to say that there's not a lot more work to do because of the structural inequalities that do exist, even in the most so-called progressive societies. But what is interesting is that we're also starting to see this rise up in Asia. There's a lot of progress that's happening in Asia. And there's a lot of evidence, for example, female startups do better when they're outside of what would be a patriarchal or subordinated cooperation regime. Then the startup is able to flourish when people work in coordinated cooperation with each other. So here's a comparison from when people think of the scientists in space, they might think of this image, but actually when the Indians sent their Mars orbiter into space, here's the picture of the scientists. So the question is, how will women transform power in the future? Will it just be the other way around? Or will it be something different? Who gets to play in that paradigm? So, to the theme of the conference, a bright future awaits you. Your future is glorious. Your future is luminous. Your future is effulgent. The future of humanity is strikingly resplendent. Now, I don't want to suggest that it's all just going to be a happy land to get there. I think there's a lot of work that we need to do, but the point is to hold this vision in place, that we can get there, that this is possible, you know. So, a little bit looking at emerging issues. As issues start to emerge, as more and more come up, they become trends. And then they become problems and issues. So if we look at the fascism, for example, or the rise of conservatism, there might have just been a few little sprinkles of it, and then it builds momentum, and then it's in your face. So this is also about anticipating change. So these futures tools that we look at is, if you start by looking down here, you can start to predict what's going to be a problem in the future, and you can start making changes to adjust for that now, rather than it landing on your doorstep unexpectedly in this time of volatility. It's not to say it won't still land on your doorstep, but then hopefully you have other processes in place to deal with it. So we're going to pretend that it's 2039. We're going to go forward 20 years into the future. And we're going to look at the education revolution, the energy shift to renewables, vegetarian as the new normal, the conservative revival, gender equity, and technologies of the mind. So we're going to pretend that 50% of education is neohumanist. That it's facilitation-based, problem-based, and it integrates spiritual learning with cognitive and action learning. Number two, we're going to assume that 50% of all homes in your region are prosumers, that is both producers and consumers, and that they're using and creating energy. That it's an integrated energy grid, and there's some kind of Uber of energy, some kind of app to facilitate your energy cooperative. We're going to assume that vegetarian is the new normal, but that vegetarian also includes lab-grown meats. We may not call it vegetarian, but for this example, we'll say veg. Ethical meat, let's say. So no animals killed, an end to the 57 billion killed annually. It slows down global warming. It's healthier. It's cheaper. And one burger was $16 US, it's now 350,000.
So can I just ask, the lab-grown meats, is that the same thing as a plant-based meat?
No, so a lab-grown meat is where they actually grow meat in basic, almost like test tubes.
Could you explain that last sentence?
What one burger, which now in nowadays might cost $16, in 2039 costs you 350,000. This is what we're imagining. We're imagining this is the circumstances in 2039.
It says used to be 350,000.
Oh, it does too. Yeah, sorry, that's just some. I need to adjust that.
Why would it be so ridiculously expensive?
It refers to the lab.
Oh no, hang on, no, sorry. This is This is the lab-grown meat. This is the lab-grown meat. Actually, used to cost 350,000, but they've brought it down. So they've made it the other way around. But we can also go the other way and say that actual animal meat costs 350,000. And reverse the pricing.
There's only one steer.
Here's a little bit more on the clean meat. So we're going to say that 50% of food eaten in your region is plant-based, meaning vegan or vegetarian. Oh, it's either vegan, vegetarian, or it's this super meat, the lab-grown meat. Currently, compared to the current day, which is 5% identify themselves as vegetarian. Number 4, fascism and conservatism. So we're going to say that the rising progressivism comes with a resisting force. There's a polarization of ideas and people, and it's going to go from 42% of adults supporting conservative worldviews to 55% of adults supporting conservative worldviews. There's an information and ideological war that breaks out in the United States between progressives and conservatives. Even more than we have now. Gender equity. So we're going to imagine that gender equity is is there in corporate boards, in the parliament, in the courts, and women in STEM, at least 50%. To give some examples, there's unfortunately no worldwide statistics, there's only country level statistics, but to give some idea of where it's at in a country like Australia, it's 27.7% for corporate boards, 32% in parliament, 10% occupy senior positions, 30% are researchers. This was the one world statistic that I could find. So then the question becomes, what would be the implications, how might policy change? And then the final one we're going to look at is the inner revolution. So currently more than 2 million practice yoga in Australia, or 8%, and we're going to imagine that it's 36% of individuals meditating or engaging in some inner practice in Australia. But I want you to, we're not in Australia obviously, so you just imagine it's whatever region that you're in. And you can use these figures as examples. So now what we're going to do is a little activity. So I've introduced you to a bunch of emerging trends and ideas to hopefully expand the horizon, get you thinking a little bit more beyond the present day problems. And we're going to do something called a futures wheel. So ordinarily, if there's an issue, you might just take a logical flow and say, this happens, which leads to this, which leads to this, which leads to this. With the futures wheel, instead you're trying to explore all of the possibilities that can happen. So this happens, which leads to this, or it could lead to this. And then from each of these, then this one could lead to this, or lead to that. So it becomes more of a wheel or more of a branching out like tree roots. Does that make sense? So you can see an example here with green meat, lab meat. So they've said, well, it's going to result in the loss of traditional farming jobs. And then that will result in a new economy or market sector and or reusing farmland for plant-based foods. Or we can go the other side. We can say lab meat's going to result in better sustainability, which will then lead to more eco-friendly something and some cleaner environment and so forth. Or you come across the side and you say, well, actually, it might also not be accepted. And then there's going to be an issue around ethics, and there's an issue around it not being natural. So do you see how the futures wheel works? It's about trying to brainstorm all of the different possibilities, not just the one that's within your own worldview. Trying to get outside your own values and your own perspective.
Satya,
Yeah.
are we going lab meat forward into the future, or lab meat backwards into now?
It'll be forward into the future. Yeah. So I'll explain in a moment. This is another example of how to do a futures wheel. It's an anticipatory exercise. So if this is how it currently is, if this is 2039 and this is how things currently are, what is that going to mean? Or we can say we are currently in 2019. We know, we're fairly certain this is going to happen in 2039. What will be the impacts that are also going on? The emerging issues at the top, there's all these issues and problems that come. At the moment, a lot of these ideas are still down in the emerging phase. So we're using the futures wheel to try and figure out what problems are going to exist What are the problems that we're going to have to solve in the future? Or what are the great things that are going to be there as well? It's not just about the problems. So here's another one, sea level rise, peak oil, water shortages. Well, it could lead to innovation or prices rise and flooding or new green social and material products for Asia and Australia. And then if we pick one of those, that could lead to a new economy and society, which innovation, redesign of the city could become the Venice of Australia, which is also a new economy and so forth. So you can see these things don't have to just separate from each other, they can come back round as well. Or it just is just really terrible. Prices rise, houses drop, depression and dislocation. Any questions on this? Because we're about to do an activity on it. Okay. So once again, here are the issues. We have the neohumanist education revolution has become national policy. The energy shift to renewables. Veg or lab-grown meat as the new normal, 50% of all food. The conservative revival. Gender equity, and technologies of the mind. What you're going to do is sit in your rows, because we're a bit too tight to sort of get into nice little groups. And I want you to discuss, I want you to do a futures wheel together. I want you to pick one of these issues. I'm going to flash them back up on the board in a moment. And I want you to start to flesh out, what are the implications if this eventuates? And I want you to think about what are neohumanist education strategies to either pursue and enhance that future, or create those effects, or prevent some of those effects. And I want you to also think beyond institutionalised learning. So it's not just about school system learning, because as we can see, the very nature of even school system learning may be challenged in another 20 years. So think about learning in all of its contexts. Because what we're going to eventually be doing is submitting proposals to the Ministry of Education and Lifelong Learning. Okay? So here we go, we're back to the issues again. I'm going to give you 20 minutes to flesh out a futures wheel.
You have a whole ream of paper and a box of pens here.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, I asked people to bring pen and paper. If you don't, please just ask for room. He can help pass them out. Okay, now the majority. Very good. Very good. Okay, so let's start with, I want to ask which groups did the neohumanist education revolution? Okay, let me hear, can I hear from this group here? What you came up with. Do you want to come up the front and present what you did with your, not everything, just the key points, like a 1 minute overview.
Hi everybody, thank you. I've got these wonderful people here, and we did, hope so much a wheel, but a great big mess. So we looked at it from several points of view. We looked at from positives that several countries would adopt a pro-neohumanist national policy in their country. There'd be world student exchanges, programs, networks, which would be virtual and based in real life. We would have systems designed that deal with the current non-renewables, and perhaps even animals that might actually eat plastic, things like that, you know, things like that. That 50% at least as a minimum of learning would occur outdoors, that the buildings of educational facilities would be in harmony with nature. Some of the resistance, there may be massive demonstrations against neohumanism, the policies that have been created and used in these countries. We may have to have enhanced security measures in some of the places of learning, but we're feeling like there'll be security measures that will be more positive powers of telepathic ability that will combat the guns and things like that. Diminished need for medical institutions because there's the natural enhanced movement towards meditation and yoga and things like that becoming the norm. So we won't have as great a need for those sorts of things in the future. Students choose their own paths of learning. You already said that, Satya, but it will be for all ages. We would all be students. As a belief in self as learners, there would be a global language of learning. Now that doesn't mean we all speak English or we all speak Italian or whatever. It actually means coming up with a variety of ways of learning. And as mentioned here, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be able to read or write. Some of it could be just verbal, oral, or whatever. So there would be some sort of commonality there. And that the sort of things we'd see from people are more heart connections, telepathic communications, young people more in touch on a global level as global citizens, not just being able to connect, but there's a really deep awareness and understanding of what that means on an empathetic and compassionate level. So, yeah, there's some of the things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to point out that I have an image in my head now of Crocodile Dundee going, "You are neohumanists." For the other groups that also did neohumanist education, did you come up with any? You probably had some similar sounding things. Did you come up with any strategies beyond this one that helped to enhance that, or even things that helped to deal with the shadow side? Did you have any additional shadow side things? Closer. I'm going to eat it.
Yeah. We were looking from the perspective how worldwide reaction could be, and so we have several realms probably opening. The best one is, well, the community sense of Europe works. We embrace neohumanism and adopts the principles, and it goes well. And that could come from the masses, from the people themselves. Then from the people themselves, it could be that there will be quite a crash from the ego-based thinking in US, which is everywhere. First, the universal awareness we are brought through now, so that it gives really a crash. Then there is a possible, coming from the masses and maybe supported by media and always, from religious offending neohumanism, which could be quite rough. And then there could be the rise of, also from the masses, with Satvipras, people who are bringing benevolent leadership on board, and that, well, we hope to have it also in the higher regions of politics. There will be a rise of new internet and info sources, and maybe it will be more clear what are the right sources, which is influenced, and we are more critical in that. Then there is another part. New technologies and humanism is a very fertile couple. That could be a future. Then there is another one, that political power, economic power will offend strongly the neohumanistic education, because it will reveal all our qualities, our inner power. So that will bring to either a new economy and another group really offending it. Then there is what we are facing is a rise of anxiety and stress problems, and that could be a very well reason why neohumanism is embraced by also organizations and worldwide influential artists.
Great, thank you. And you see that by doing the Future's Built process on this, they've seen other emerging trends that are actually outside of this particular issue, but which they can piggyback on the back of in order to get more, like the stress, for example, the rising stress, this type of thing. Let's take a look at another one. Did anyone do the energy shift to renewables?
Okay, we've got up to solar and wind, just didn't get away after time. Essentially, to do with efficiency of production. Yeah, the efficiency of production of the panels or other sources have to keep on increasing. We were concerned about the recycling of panels because every kind of technology has a lifespan anyway. Now I understand that the lifespan of solar panels could be anywhere between 10 to 30 years. So you have to have a recycling economy. That's the main thing, one of the main things you have to have as the norm. So that's got to be taught in schools, and that's got to be understood by the general public and the population. Solar energy could come, the type of technology for solar energy could be a number of types. It could be like community cooperatives, where people harness individually or households or whatever, you know, the point of making the energy from the solar panel is, and sharing that in a cooperative way. That's one way. I understand though that there's some potential extra cost with cabling and everything, so that's a kind of a negative that you definitely have to take into account, and cabling can also be quite complex as well. So that's why probably at the moment we have large solar farms. And those solar farms actually take up a lot of area. I've seen quite a number of them. And there's even some argument that it could be better used for food production. Or I guess the solution is to have both together, the solar panels and the plants. So all these have got to be things that have got to be taken into account. So there's small solar panels, there's large solar farms. So you have to weigh up, I guess, what's the best alternative in each case. The other one might not be by 2038, but it's certainly been talked about, is capture of solar energy from the sun in outer space rather than on rooftops. And then you have these big energy stations up in space, and they transfer the energy down to Earth, or it could be for ships on the ocean, or it could be for planes, that sort of thing. I'm not too sure if that's by 2038, would you know?
Who knows?
Okay, yeah. Anyway, I've read about it and we put it in there. So there's a number of economic impacts. For example, who's going to benefit by this? Is it the more wealthy people or everybody in the whole community? So the whole thing about maximum amenities available to some, while others have minimum amenities, this is the proud concept, and reducing the gap, how that's going to be done. So there has to be a lot of economic policy making about that, which could be quite complex. So that's all about policies of fair distribution. And the other thing, of course, is that retraining the workforce. Different curriculums in not only schools, but possibly in community learning centres, particularly if you have cooperative type energy sharing, so that the members of the community understand how these things operate, how they can be better, more efficient, how to run them and all the technology side, which could be a bit complicated for some people. Or alternatively, it could all be done by robots. So then you have to work out what the people will do with their extra time, if they have it. That's a bit of a complicated issue, because I'm arguing that people's minds then have to be employed in more complex tasks. Maybe they won't have the free time they need. It's hard to say, but anyway, basically all that's going to be taken into account in social and economic policy making. There's loss of jobs. And ultimately that might give rise to some kind of concept of universal basic income on a rational fair basis. That's already been talked about anyway. Those ideas are out there. And there's some concern about aesthetics. Some people go on about the aesthetics of wind power, but I understand there's even different turbines, like the inner revolving ones compared to the round ones. So aesthetics is important. You know, the human mind actually does get elevated by aesthetics. So we have to take that into account if we're going to elevate society. We also have to consider the aesthetics of our energy sources as well. There's lots of other things, but I think that's enough.
Great, thank you very much. Another good example of lots of different ideas coming together, and you can see where the neo-humanist education policy might come in, even on the economic level. How do we retrain our economists to think differently, to a more sharing economy, to a redistribution economy? More, yeah. Anyway, completely different level, and also good exploration of the shadow side of things. That it's there are negatives to renewables. You know, what are we going to do with recycling of the cells?
I could see the rise of the renewable energy complex blocking future technologies.
Yeah.
Maybe oil blocks renewables.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. It could potentially block wave or some of these other opportunities. That's true. And then what was the other shadow that you mentioned? I guess it was mostly like the economic. There's the recycling aspect to it, and there's the aesthetics.
Competition with agriculture.
Oh yeah, competition with agriculture. That's another one as well. Yeah, very good. Were there any other groups that did this topic? No. So, veg is the new normal. Which groups did veg is the new normal? Anybody? No? Yes? No? Okay. What about the conservative revival? Did anyone do the conservative revival? No? Too scary? One? Yep.
I just want to say that I wanted to. Hi, I just want to say that I wanted to do it, and we got about 30 seconds in. Let me put it this way. Every year, tens of billions of babies are born. A number of those are humans for the first time. A number of those have only been humans for a short relative time. Our societies cherish tolerance and diversity. So these little problems that become trends and et cetera, we cherish those. And we don't want to deal with them until it's late. So you can't just say, well, no problem, we'll get rid of everybody who thinks like that. It doesn't happen. It's not going to happen. So I have no idea.
No, it's a very good point, and this is also about seeing, I think a lot of the strategies that would come with overcoming the fascist revival or the conservative revival is an educational strategy, but it's one that helps people to feel included. Because at the moment we see like a lot of fighting in a way that actually really alienates and makes people more stuck in their positions. I don't think we necessarily have the answers right now, but we need to think of a smarter way of doing it without accepting something that's going to make us more divided.
This is my first neohumanist conference, and even though we did neohumanist education, we looked at it from a spiritual aspect. And I'm someone who firmly has feet planted in a neo-humanistic Catholic identity. And one of the things I noticed is that if you want to incorporate more people to get on board, we need to step back from a negative connotation of people of religion or people of faith. I think you can be both a Catholic and a neo-humanist at the same time. And we need to have more empathy. There's a big push against dogma, I understand that, but we need to be more open. But that was the one thing that I feel rose to me during this. But I'm very grateful to be here, but I think we have to be more open.
Yeah, and just to clarify that there's, the conservative revival doesn't mean isn't referring to religion per se. It can, but the point is that within any religion there is a conservative element and there's a non-conservative element. There's a mystical element, there's a dogmatic element. And I think spirituality is about the mystical element in all of the various groups, right? And this is also, I think, what neo-humanism tries to imbibe. When you look at Sarkar's writings on religion versus spirituality, this is the point. It's about the path of the mystic.
We just have to be careful how we approach it when we're talking about it.
This is true,
as
yeah.
far as putting things down.
Yeah, no, that's very true. There's a sensitivity that's required, yeah. Okay, so gender equity. Did anybody touch gender equity? Let's go for the group at the back here.
Stand up.
So we didn't concentrate on 50% on all boards. We concentrated mostly on genuine gender equity. And what we came up with, if the real awareness increases with people, so then they will understand the gender roles in a different way. And that causes change in society and the way people think. So, coming from this point of view, that if you have like a real sense and like appreciation of women's and men's own tendencies and everything, so then they will think in a different way, like in structures of society and education, the structures will change. Because instead of having men planning the system and the women taking care of that, they work together and plan together. So that could lead to neohumanist education and a neohumanistic outlook in society. And then we looked at childcare. So childcare arrangement would improve. There would be possibility for good quality childcare and possibility to take care of children yourself at home. There would be economic possibility to stay at home also and take care of your own children. And then we were thinking like globally, that would cause economic independence to women, which would lead to change in the social structure and less poverty. Then education would be available to women, and then better health also, and that would lead a better health for the children as well. And then one point we're thinking about, that if more and more women are working, the population will start to decrease, that they will have less and less children. So then we're thinking, what could this lead to? Maybe producing babies in laboratories, and then what could be the drawback of this? So this could be that then there would be ethical issues about choosing the genes of the babies which we produce in the laboratories.
Who's going to raise the babies?
Well, I don't know. Maybe in the child care places, we didn't get really that far. These are those ideas that we were discussing.
Thank you very much. The other group that did neohumanist education, can you talk about any of the shadow side? Oh, sorry, gender. Do you think about any of the shadow side? Not so much. Because it's very easy to think about anything that sounds positive, it's very easy to think about the positive implications, but you've got some comments on shadow?
Scott is our home. Actually, Amrita mentioned that there will be less babies. Scott had one suggestion, and I think he has done some research on that, is uterus transplants to men. Men will have babies.
That doesn't necessarily help with gender equity.
We solve some problems, right? We share the burden.
Yeah, what I suggested was let's try to eliminate gender issues as much as possible. We're all on a continuum to start with. There's just a spectrum. But the fact is that certain sectors of that spectrum are treated differently, without question.
So,
Okay, to continue to summarize our discussion, is at least in Asia, women have a very tough role because they are mothers, they are wives, they are daughters-in-laws, and they have jobs. They're stressed out. And so they are very often very depressed. So if we were to develop gender equality, I beg your pardon? So we would have to look at these socio-economic issues. One approach is that we see is that because of the capitalist system, the woman has to play so many roles. So we have to move to what is then discussed as a localized economy. Basically, Samaj model. And part of that is we have a more child-centered society. Means that taking care of kids is not just one person's role in the family, but it is a community. And that involves, again, changes in how we produce our food. And if we can change how we produce food, we also can deal with global warming. It's more labor-intensive probably, but we can suck up the CO2. Did we have other points? We have many points.
What about the shadow? Do you have any on the shadow side? What are the negatives?
Do we have shadows?
Only the
Actually, Scott is very original thinker. I mean, the gender is going to be erased. He wants to erase the he and the she thing. And actually in this case, maybe I can share a small story from our master. Our master used to be very strict, and he would scold us terribly sometimes, very painfully. And so somebody came to him and
keep him on the audience.
But when we actually come to the point is we have to transcend how we look at gender. And the point is that we can look at each other from a spiritual perspective. And I think that is an endeavor that's part of neohumanism that we discussed.
So can I ask from the crowd, what might be the shadow side of gender equity?
What's the man, I guess?
Yeah.
a rise of conservative men protesting and turn back the clock.
And actually we see that now with the rise of incels, involuntary celibates and things like this.
I think it will be less creativity.
Why is that?
Next conference. Yeah, you see, that's my. There's a study on this. For example, because of men competition mind, women in Europe has lowered the voice in the last 40 years of half octave. So the voice of the female are trying to adjust with the voice of the male. This is something I invented. They are studying it because the competition in the man psychology is there, and they can handle it somehow. Also with war, but also with brotherhood. That's the one thing. What I want to say is there is two poles, and they have seen it that there is a distance between these two poles. The energy gap is bigger and there is bigger creativity because there is also clash. So clash and cohesion is part of evolution. If everything becomes one, let's say, or same, there will be no polarization. If there is no polarization, there is no life. So everything is the same, there is no creativity. Because of the differences of gender, you go and see the nature. I'll just tell you one small example. My father was a farmer also. He put the kiwi in my house, the first one. Then everybody put kiwi around. My neighbor, he wanted to compete with my father. He also put the kiwi. Result, no kiwis. Because he just put the male kiwi. There is male kiwi and female kiwi. Okay, just to tell you, even in the nature there is male and female, even the trees have male. So when there is gender, I agree with him that from the spiritual point of view, we are one. But we should not forget our glands, our hormones, the difference that makes this gap, and this gap is something important to keep on the movement.
I just want to respond to that because I know a lot of hands are going up, so I need to introduce a little bit of feminist theory here. So, first of all, it's important to note that there's men's culture and women's culture. There are some glandular influences, like it's very obvious in a 3-year-old boy once the testosterone kicks in that they behave very differently to 3-year-old girls. But often this biological conclusion is used as a means to suppress women. And this is the problem with the biological argument, is that it's used primarily as a tool of suppression, so it has to be used very, very sensitively. Your point about polarization, men and women becoming the same, I don't think is what is going to happen here. It's about women's culture having becoming its own and becoming larger, because then you still maintain the polarity of sorts. At the same time, it's really important that we stay away from gender roles. To say that women's culture is this and only ever this is also a problem, because it's actually a spectrum. So you might say that the average of women's culture is here, but the breadth of the spectrum is wider than the gap to the average of men's culture. And this is the part that is often forgotten, and it's the reason why men feel boxed in to an idea of masculinity which often does not represent them. It's the reason why women often feel boxed into an idea of femininity which does not represent them. Instead, it's about both of us, both genders and third genders, because actually there's more than just the binary. Being able to find the masculine traits, which are not purely biological, by the way, and the feminine traits within us to become whole humans. Anyway, that's feminism 101.
And just to follow up on what you said, I think the issue here is on the access of opportunity and choice. And I think that is the overall issue. So for example, to follow up on what you said and what on Cristiano, I think, on Cristiano said, so it's not that because 50% male workers have to be engineers and 50% have to be female male engineers. It's not about that. It's about the access that women have, the same opportunities to men, and that then it's up to them to decide. And the same goes for the men. So for example, given the child issue, for me it's a very sensitive personal issue. So for example, as a woman, I want to have the right to choose if I want to have kids or not. I don't want to be in a social situation where people ask me, are you married when I'm going to have kids? It's like, that's a complete, you know. So, and I think for men, for example, in Malta, women have 4 months paternity leave. Men have 1 week. That's not fair. So I think in that situation, it is again, access to opportunity of, for example, parental leave, whether you're male or female, and so I think that's the overall issue with regards to gender equality.
Exactly. I just want to... And so I want to emphasise then that one of the challenges that come is if there are some very small brands of feminism which are of a more dominant variety, but I would say that mainstream feminism is not seeking to achieve dominance over men. No. However, let's say one of the shadow sides of gender equity could be that women who get into power use the same dominating techniques that we see in male culture. Not to say that all men are like this, once again it's culture, there's a difference, right? So if women are just adopting the same culture that we currently see, then that's going to be a problem. So this is where strategies such as coordinated cooperation, which Satya talks about, versus subordinated cooperation are important. We need to get, and this also removes the gender from the discussion, makes it much easier to discuss. We need to move away from a subordinated cooperation framework and into a coordinated cooperation framework. I want to move on from gender because I know it's highly explosive. Let's look at technologies of the mind. Did anybody do technologies of the mind?
Okay, our group is talking about the technology of the mind, also the technology of the AI. So we have two models here. One model is very traditional one, the capitalism one. It's a very linear model. First begin from the company, they want to earn money. So they ask the scientists to have the product of what they want. They can make money. And then they have some product. And this product, like the now FB or some AI, they say they take control of our life. It seems we are control the FB, but since actually it's the FB that control the waste many our time here. So people become unhappy and meaningful this. So we think we should have another model that was based on crowd and neohumanism model. This model was the highest value of the society was oneness and connection. The social, every people's basic need, like education and clothes and housing, and everything should be considered. And based on these values, we think the technology of the mind, meditation, is important because it creates feedback. For example, the product now use the society, and if the more people that do meditation and they feel this product didn't bring happy to their life, then this conclusion, the result should become a indicator that this product should be paid more tax. If more people are unhappy, this product should be pay more tax to the society because it makes more people unhappy. Yeah, so it creates not just a linear process, but it becomes a feedback. And also we have some negative consequences that will be introduced by Sister here.
Yes, we are thinking about the negative consequence. And maybe could be a violent revolution for those who don't want a change. Because if there is a change in the mind of people, it's more difficult that people could be exploited. And we are maybe we don't buy too much things because we don't need it. We just find the purity of life, and we can be happy with very simple things. And you are not be fascinated to all the fashion and everything people want to sell us. And maybe this is not good for the company. They are not happy about it. And maybe they can put some strategy to cannot arise with this meditation. And we also thinking about that someone could take meditation as a dogma, and if they can feel the real importance of meditation and what it could transform in you, you can develop a superiority complex, and maybe you are not compassionate with people who don't want to meditate. And maybe they cannot understand the goal of meditation, and this can create a polarization in the society. And stop. One thing. No,
thank you. So we can see the link between AI, so it's almost like gross national happiness of the AI products that comes about as a result of meditation, but then with the shadow side being related to things like fascist meditators, for example. It happens, right? You know, we really have to guard against these things. and also the impact that it's going to have on companies, and then what resistance we might see with that, this type of thing.
Yeah, we have two things. So we were thinking that there would be a national policy for introducing contemplative practices and reflective learning in all grades of schools. And some of the positive consequences of this would be like a decrease in crime long term, because children will be meditating. And also a significant decrease in mental illness diagnosis, such as ADHD, for example, which is one of the most kind of common ones amongst children. But as a result of this, there would also be like a pharmaceutical appeal to the FDI for review, and on the basis of this being kind of not evidence-based practice and so on. So there would be a whole kind of thing going on there. Then we thought of like, I mean, smaller but good things like integrative medicine will be part of schools. Let's see, institutions of adult education will also adopt these practices. Universities will start ethics researches. There will also be like a conservative religious opposition to this, kind of like you mentioned before with the Buddhists, which is already happening. One important thing that we were thinking was that there would be some kind of Supreme Court decision around this topic, like is this personal growth or is this religious practice, which will be central. And let's see what else. And then there's a whole other thing that there would be like a commodification of contemplative practices, as with everything, and products, so like selling of yoga mats and new apps and computer systems to schools that try to capitalize on this opportunity. But that would also be kind of a supportive force for this. So it's both plus and minus. So businesses will support this on the premises of productivity. What else? Well, parent-teacher organizations in support of or in opposition of this. Yes, the plant-based food industry will also capitalize on this, which is also both a plus and a minus. I mean, it's really is a plus, I think, but they will make some money off it. Do you want to add something that I forgot? Yeah, I also wrote a rise of fake gurus and ideologies competing. So kind of like a discernment of like, you know, this will also be like a massive market, which I feel like we're already seeing to a certain extent, right? We're like, what is true, and it's hard to choose. Okay.
Thank you. On the topic of discernment, obviously that also has, that plays into the neo-humanist education paradigm. How do we teach, you know, tomorrow's leaders and participants, I guess you could say, to be in a position where they can discern these things? Because this is a big challenge that we're seeing right now. People who aren't able to discern these things, they don't know who to follow, they don't know who to listen to. So now what we're going to do is you're going to go back into your groups and we're going to develop a checklist, because a lot of these policy decisions that we make, we can act upon sentiment to say, oh yeah, renewables, that's a great idea. But actually, we may not be acting from a point of rationality. So Satya, when he talks about neohumanism, he talks also about the role of instinct versus sentiment, versus rationality and intuition. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room might say, oh, I always act out of intuition, but actually it might just be instinct. It's very hard to tell the difference between these two. So this is, the role of rationality is super, super important in that we study these topics well. So what I want you to do is reverse engineer what would be a checklist so that when you look at a given policy, that it's going to be one that's in alignment with neo-humanist education principles. So we need to bypass the sentiment. What makes a policy or strategy in line with it? What questions would you ask of the policy to check that it's neo-humanist? So let me give an example. You might say a renewable energy policy the way that it's being implemented, is it for the welfare of the majority? Does it give equal access and distribution, perhaps? I don't know if that's a good checklist or not. We're going to test them later. But so I'm going to give you 10 minutes in your groups to come up with a checklist of what questions. It will actually be for any policy, but you can do it based on the experience that you've just had, because you've explored not only the good things, but also what are the bad things, what is the shadow side. So rather than just saying renewables is good no matter what, well, actually there's some detail around that, isn't there? So then what are the questions you would ask in order to make sure that the detail checks out okay? So we'll give you 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back. Let's get ready to test our checklists.
Me too.
Are there any groups that would be willing to be a guinea pig so that we can trial their checklist? Any groups? No one wants to be a guinea pig? Yep, great, come on up. Okay, so everyone, attention back to the front, please. And we're going to listen to Scott. He's going to discuss the checklist that he came up with.
Hello. There was essentially no time, as you're all noticing right now. When I look at, what questions would you ask of the policy to check the neohumanists, I instantly turn to gross national happiness, which has checklists for government on policy to check if it is, well, they say humanist, but, neo-humanist. And we really didn't have much time. So, just so you know, the 9 counts in classic gross national happiness are psychological well-being, including spiritual, material well-being, good governance, health, education, community vitality, cultural diversity and resilience, balanced time use, and ecological diversity. So we got started, and so which of those apply to gender equity issues? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The only one that really didn't was ecological diversity, and that's as far as we got.
That's no problem. Just wait here for a moment, because we're going to test it on a few other things. I would actually argue that ecological diversity, you could argue that gender diversity is a type of ecological diversity perhaps as well.
Yes.
Well, because when you've got two, it's a type of diversity. I mean, human beings are within the ecosystem as well, right? So.
Okay, we included cultural diversity.
Oh, cultural diversity, yeah. So we're going to test your checklist. Here we go. So we've got, we'll get some audience participation in this one. So how do the following proposals fare? Let's look at the first one. So the first one is, the proposal is for tight regulation on meditation education. If we have a look at your policy checklist, would it pass? So the first one, psychological well-being. Tight regulation.
Well, sure, psychological well-being, yes, assuming the government has the right metrics for meditation education. Good government is on the list also. Material well-being is not really there. Health, yes. Education, maybe. It depends how it's done. Community vitality, absolutely. Cultural diversity, I don't know. Is it relevant?
In your checklist it is. So let's say that it is relevant, that you need to have diversity of meditation methods.
Okay, okay.
So therefore it doesn't pass that piece. And then keep going.
Okay. Balanced time use refers to not being forced to do, for example, too much work in or out of the house, or too much politics, whatever.
It may be, some of them may not be applicable,
Yeah.
which is fine.
Oh, right. And ecological diversity. The goal of the list, by the way this is used is it's graded on a scale. and you have to get a certain count in order for it to be passed as law. So, if you get 80 out of 100, then it's absolutely in. If it's 30 out of 100, it's absolutely rejected. If it's in the middle, it needs to be revised, something like that.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay.
I'm going to ask for another group to come up and share their checklist. Oh no, that's fine. But hold on to it because I'll take a photo of it later. Is there another group that's willing to come up and share their checklist with the group? Yeah, come up. So the question is, how do we relate this to the checklist? So if I come along and say, right, I'm sick of all of these different meditation groups doing whatever they want and just calling it meditation, we need a policy that is really tight and says, this is how you do meditation and it's only like this. That's my policy proposal.
That's wrong.
And then based on the checklist that we just saw from Scott, there were some things that it was okay for, and there were other things that it wasn't, like diversity. What about other methods of meditation, for example?
Deregulation.
Deregulation, yeah. This is tight regulation versus deregulation. So then, first I'll get you to explain your checklist, and then we'll take a look at the example.
So we took a little bit different approach. Maybe we didn't understand so much about how this exercise, but we took one policy of that areas we're looking at. It means we took the policy of having 50% men and 50% women on all education boards, and then we made a checklist for that particular policy. But it can be, in a way, also connected to this. So our main point would be to, because simply placing 50% women, if they are thinking same way like men, or it doesn't make any difference at all. So then there should be some way to assess those people who are on the education board, to know that they are good in education, they understand neohumanism, they have neohumanist values and outlook, and in such a way that they are the right people to not have bias, to have that inclusive understanding of all the people, and they would be the people who would be able to make the best policies for the education board. So
we could say that this would be the right people with the right skills, or as the actors in the policy.
Like if you would suggest that you have a tight regulation of meditation education, then those people who would regulate this education, meditation education, they would have to be the right people. And I think it would be maybe a little bit difficult to choose who are those right people, because I think most people would not agree. So I suppose it should be also that if you're not able to agree on who are those people who get to decide what kind of meditation education all the other people are getting, then you shouldn't have this kind of regulation.
Very good. Very nice. Did you have anything else in there?
Just for our education board, we said that you should choose people with different strengths to complement each other. So if you make an education board, that people should come with different kind of skills, that you make a working board. Yeah.
Is there anybody else that has a longer checklist that they would like to share with the rest of the group? No? Yeah, please.
So we took the topic of neohumanist training as ours to see how you could create a checklist for that. And the first thing we came up with, which we felt was really important, was access. So how do you ensure that it has maximum diversity, so that on an economical especially, because we don't want just people that can afford to take the training to be able to do it. So you need to look at that, have a system that actually creates that. And that's not just an economical, but on a geographical and a technological basis as well. So that's one. The next one is credibility of the training offered and the credibility on the trainers. So who gets to decide what's best practice? Who gets to decide what is the curriculum and what it should be? Who designs it? So who's checking on the trainer? and that it would need to be people with have an open mind. So that would be important, and that training has a balance of practical and internal. We need to look at the delivery of the training. How's it going to happen? Where's it going to happen? Who is going to do it? We need to have a checklist for determining the starting point of the training. So where do you enter, at which point? And that it does cover all the components. So I sort of mentioned before, it has the practical, the actual doing, the intellectual, so that's evidence, research-based, the internal, so your personal, your inner resources working on that. And yeah, that's sort of it in a bit of a nutshell.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so actually, before you go, let's take a look at this second policy. And we're going to use your checklist, or the elements of your checklist that make sense. We can adjust it on the fly, right? So we've got relationship education for teenagers that includes navigating romantic relationships with robots. That's my policy recommendation for the Ministry of Education and Lifelong Learning. How does it fare against your checklist? This is the play, so there's no right or wrong at this point. It's only learning.
Okay, all right. Well, I think we've got it covered with the access. Like we want relational relationships with robots. Okay. Well, we want to make sure that everybody has access to this possibility in their life, that they can sit down with a robot and have a romantic relationship. So we just don't want it to be just for the teenagers that can afford it, or who live near these robots. So yeah, so we will actually cover that with our system to check it is available to everybody. Credible, is that the credibility of the robots or the teenagers?
However you want to apply the checklist.
Okay.
You can adjust it. You can adjust the checklist on the go. No problem.
I can have my team add to this, by the way. Otherwise, it's just my interpretation. Okay, the credibility. Well, we would hope that the robots that are made, that are delivering these, well, at least half of the relationship, are made with some sort of internal compassion and empathy and kindness and love and respect. So we're hoping that they're the sorts of robots that our teenagers would choose to have relationships with, so that they can also become better people for the good of all. So I'm throwing in a few of those great words. Who designs the robot? Well, see, this is what we're looking at. Who is going to check on the people that design that robot? So that's going to be a really important thing. Yeah, who designs the education?
Is there an abstinence agenda, is the question from the floor.
Good point. And, you know, are those robots able to, you know, well, I'm sure they can be practical because they can move, one would hope. Intellectual, well, we'd have to, that comes back to what you were saying as well, how much research is done around them, the evidence that these relationships are going to actually work, you know. And internal could be a bit tricky, but then we could perhaps have something where the teenagers get to assess the outcome of their relationships with these robots. So yeah, it'd be very interesting.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to split back up into our groups for, it'll be about 7 minutes, and what I'm going to get you to do is revise your checklist and come up with a policy proposal for the Ministry of Education and Lifelong Learning based on some of the ideas and topics that you've seen today. Don't spend too long thinking about the policy. This is meant to be a bit of a fun sort of activity. And then we're going to pick a couple of people. They will come up the front and they will argue for their policy on the basis of the checklist that they've come up with. It might be that you only have 3 or 4 things in your checklist, that's fine, or it might be that you have 20. But the point is to sort of just go through the process. That's the main point. Okay? Are there any questions about what you have to do? Is that clear? So refine the checklist and develop a proposal, because the Ministry of Education and Lifelong Learning, there's a €50 million or dollar budget to make it a nice big proposal that you can potentially win a grant for. Okay. So, wrapping up your conversation. Let's turn our chairs around, come back to the front. And switching off the conversations. Okay, so is everybody ready? Ready and listening? Ready to go? Okay. All right, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to hear from 3 groups that I'm going to pick at random, sort of random, not really, because obviously I'm applying my own bias here. And what they're going to do is present, actually, is Radhika in the back there? Yeah, come up the front. We're going to fast forward 20 years. She does? Can someone else speak on her behalf?
I can. We too. For the
No, the reason why is because Radhika is about to become the Minister of Education and Lifelong Learning. So come up the front. Take a seat. So Radhika is the Minister of Education and Lifelong Learning, and I'm going to pick 3 groups to come up and present their proposal to Radhika. And you have 50 million, either US dollars or euros, depending on what the group say, that you can allocate funding from. So you're going to choose which proposal you like the best. Okay. You don't have to base it on any checklist. You're just going to be just like a good politician, purely sentiment. Okay? Okay, so speak clearly when you come up. So I'm going to pick 3 groups and come up and just a very quick, like 1-minute presentation. What's your proposal and what are some of the key things that you believe that it meets the neo-humanist checklist, including a couple of the shadow points. All right, let's pick this group here.
Okay, our proposal is that there's meditation, education for health and for all. That's the proposal. Meditation, education for all.
Will be available. Will be available. Is it compulsory or what is the plan? Give us a few more details about it. Is it compulsory?
That it be available.
That it's available. Okay, very good. Can you run through points on neo-humanist checklist ideas for why this would be neo-humanist?
According to our checklist?
Yep.
Okay, so it has to meet a parental component. I mean, this is because we did.
Yep. Just pick 3 or 4 key points from your checklist.
Okay, parental component for parental personal development in neohumanism and or other members become familiar with it. That it reaches, that it respects multi-faith traditions within the community, school, whatever, to dissolve polarity.
Great. Excellent. Okay, so we have meditation for all. It's not compulsory. Has multi-faith aspects to make it more universal. And I forget the other point. Parental approval involved as well. Okay. Personal development. So, and it's not just for children; it's also for adults. Is that understand? Through the life cycle. Very good. Do you understand that policy? Meditation for all. At all ages. We'll come back. There's one to consider. Okay, I'm going to pick another group. All right. How about you guys? passing the microphone.
Our group was also talking about meditation and yoga for all in the schools, and that it would be presented on the basis of medical research and psychological research, and that it would be available for all. It might be somewhat compulsory, but there would be a variety of techniques rotated and introduced into the school that would also include the arts in promoting meditation and yoga. What am I leaving out? Oh, also instituting social service as a part of the curriculum.
Okay.
And that would also be compulsory, and the choice of social service could be up to the students and as well. So it would be pretty open.
Yeah. And then how about the key elements of your checklist to check whether it's neo-humanist or not?
Well, that it would be available to all.
Yeah.
That it would be accessible to all.
Yeah. And that it brings happiness. And is there anything to address any of the resistance and backlash in terms of the checklist questions that you had?
Just diversity.
Diversity?
Surveys.
Is okay to check how people are doing?
And welcoming input.
And welcoming input. Okay, very good. All right. So Radhika, you've got a choice between meditation for all that is not compulsory and based on, I guess multiple traditions versus one that has a bit more to it, but has some compulsory elements is the main differences. Okay, anyone who doesn't have a meditation one? Does anyone know? You don't? All right, here we go.
Okay. Can you hear me? So our proposal is that we need to redesign curriculum and school spaces in order to bring nature literacy and passion for protecting the environment, awakening love of the environment in the children by introducing permaculture principles into education, particularly early childhood and primary. Also, we are not yet ready to go into secondary, so we have, and to offer, so the components of our proposal would be to have allocate a budget towards redesign of outdoor spaces in educational institutions, as well as teacher training, materials, and to be able to teacher training, materials, and yeah, spaces, to be able to have spaces so that the education is not taking place only in inside, but also taking place in outdoor spaces. And the goal of this is to be able to address in a sustainable way a change of values in society, so that society will move culturally in a direction that will protect the planet and regenerate the earth.
Thank you very much.
Due to our current climate crisis.
Okay. So questions for you. What about your neo-humanist checklist? What were some of the core questions from the neo-humanist checklist that you applied to this proposal?
Well, ours, we were thinking about what is neo-humanism, and so we did include the idea of collective welfare. Now, does this policy take care of the welfare of other entities, besides human beings of the earth? Does it take care of people? Does it nurture people? Would it serve the future generations? So I think we passed those. Yeah. And then does it also encourage contemplation? Does it encourage an inner connection? And yes, being able to awaken a love for nature means to be able to spend time in nature, to have people that are trained to guide you in having a connection to nature. So yes, we also thought it would make kids more contemplative. And does the policy help us to bring closer to the goal of developing full human beings that have compassion and values? And so, yes, we also thought that this policy would help children to get an education that just doesn't make them learned monsters, but that makes them also more compassionate about the earth and the environment that they're living in? And does it help to expand the mind beyond limiting ideas and lead us towards more universal consciousness? Yes, because then it would be, this type of education would help children to not just think about humans, but also to think about being part of a big interconnected web of life. And so, again, we think that that would expand their consciousness. And those are the elements that we came up with as being essential to the idea of neohumanism.
Very good. Was there anything in the shadow side that you had to address?
No.
The permaculture fascists. Not yet. That will come.
We hadn't analyzed this particular thing earlier when we were doing the analysis of the future thing.
No problem, no problem. The point that I'm making is just to always get you thinking outside of your paradigm and your reality as much as you can, including really negative aspects, the dogmatic aspects that can come from something that's even really good. All right, Radhika, so you have a choice between the meditation available for all, the meditation that's a little bit compulsory but includes social service and other components, versus the permaculture program that would be rolled out in all schools, noting that it is 2039, so probably you're ready to do it to high schools, I would guess, by now as well. So, where do you want to allocate your money?
Thank you for giving me the chance to be a chair of the education. And I would say that for me, all is good, but I prefer the second and third. If let me have to choose one, I think I will choose the third one. The reason is that for the department of education, I would think about the skill, because I want to spread the new humanist education in all the human society, not just maybe for one set or one dog. I want to spread the seed all over the society, the skill. The second one is efficient. It's easy to copy. It's like the not. How to say the. Duplicate, and also the way to show the education can be various, but it's the concept. The concept must be easy to copy. And the third one, I would say it's wide accepted. I mean, for example, the first one, you mentioned about the meditation. For example, in China, when you focus on the meditation for the children, you will be sensitive. I think you just do the yoga and meditation, we don't want it.
It wasn't, that's the thing about it.
No, this is not compulsory. Whereas the second one was compulsory.
Okay.
So,
yeah, maybe mixed, but yeah. So it's maybe, so it's wide accepted concept. I mean, for example, the third one I like it's like involved global non-benefit organization. So it's not so sensitive to accept it because we are non-beneficial and kind of do the good thing for the education. So maybe it's easier for all the human beings to accept it. So and the fourth one is budget cut. So of course it is very important. So and budget cut because I really said more. So I think it has a very have more plan. Think about maybe the solid building or something. So I think it's maybe budget is lower.
So just like a really good minister, she's thinking about. She's thinking about how much is it going to cost, which is the cheapest, and which is going to be more readily accepted by all. Okay, I want to thank you very much for your role, Radhika. Thank you all for your participation. Even though you might not have a concrete checklist, I hope that you've taken something out of the process and that you can therefore apply the process in future scenarios. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you, Satya. We're long over this.